you never have to be an expert because there's only one you. You can position yourself as understanding of Japan. You don't have to know when the Tokugawa shogunate started and ended. You don't have to know the Meiji Restoration. You don't have to even speak Japanese very well. It doesn't matter that much. You just have to have a really good point of view that is backed by experience and ideas. That point of view is uniquely yours. So if you can do that and continue to do that, you will establish your credibility in whatever area you choose. It takes a long time though, a lot of time and consistency.
皆さんこんにちは。ビジネス Success Japan のポッドキャストへようこそ。Hello everyone and welcome to the Business Success Japan podcast. This is your host, Lydia Buchman. This podcast is made for those who want to develop or strengthen the communication skills, cultural savvy, insights into current trends and conditions, and mindsets that are essential in a Japanese business environment. The helpful, practical suggestions and engaging insights offered here provide listeners with the in-depth cultural context needed to achieve their own version of success while collaborating with Japanese counterparts. In today's episode, I have the pleasure of sharing a conversation I had with Daniel Nestle. Dan is the leader of communications for Lixil Americas, an award-winning global communications and marketing leader with over 20 years of success in the B2B services, manufacturing, finance, and education sectors. His broad areas of expertise include digital communications, integrated marketing communications, content marketing, social media strategy, and brand storytelling. Earlier in his career, Dan spent 16 years living and working in Japan, first as an educator and later as a corporate marketing and communications professional. As a result, he speaks Japanese, and Dan also obtained his MS in Internet Marketing from Full Sail University, as well as a BA in International Relations from the University of Pennsylvania. An active content creator, in 2020 he launched his own weekly podcast, The Dan Nestle Show. Be sure to keep listening to learn more about what he's learned throughout his career and history in Japan. Thank you so much for sharing your time on the podcast today. I'm really excited to share this conversation with my audience, but would you mind just briefly introducing yourself to get started?
Sure. And thanks, Lydia, for having me on. I'm Dan Nestle. I'm the leader of communications for Lixil Americas. And Lixil is a big Japanese company, in case some of your listeners may or may not be aware of it. And I've been at the company now for a little over 2 years. Before that, I was at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. And I lived in Japan for 16 years earlier in my life. So I'm a very deeply steeped into Japan, into Japanese business practices. And I do speak Japanese, maybe not super well, but I speak Japanese well enough to conduct business. I am, I live in New Jersey, and I left Japan in 2009. Yeah, I left Japan in 2009, but I go back quite often, so I like to keep up with what's going on in Japan, and sort of has to stay in my blood regularly. Kind of like an inoculation you have to have. When you leave Japan, you always gotta. Well, if you've been there for a while, you feel like you need to get back. So I got to go back and get a dose, and that keeps me going for a while. And then I got to go back again, and so on and so forth. And I think that's going to be the way it is forever. So sorry about that very long, winding road, but that's the top line intro. If there's anything else you want to know, I'm an open book. Well, I think like a lot of people who probably listen to your show, and like you, Lydia, I was on the JET program initially, way back in the earlier days. I wasn't like as far back as like the Mombusho Fellows, but shortly thereafter. So in 1993, I went over as part of the JET program to Mie Prefecture, and I was sent to a really small town called Owase, famous for having the most rain on Honshu in Japan, and great fish. And timber industry. So it was really an amazing countryside experience. I stayed there for 3 years and, learned some really amazing yet horrifying regional Japanese that didn't suit me well in Tokyo, to be honest with you. But then I left after the JET program. After my 3 years were up, I traveled to Tokyo to seek my fame and fortune. I didn't get either one, but I did have a really great time and managed to find a career eventually. I moved to Tokyo in, I guess, 96, 97, and then stayed there for 13 years. I lived all over Tokyo. So I lived on the west side, the east side. Started off working at universities but not for universities, at an extracurricular program for universities. And that sort of led me into recruitment, which also seems to be a path for a lot of ex-English teachers trying to find their way in Japan. Recruitment led me into a consulting business, .com era, kind of started. I was with a startup company in Japan for a year or so, and then gradually moved over into a more corporate environment. Figured out that I didn't like being in a corporate environment at the time. Started my own business, became a copywriter and editor, and had 4 years of fantastic self employment until I ended up back in the corporate arms of a big global multinational recruitment company doing marketing and communications. And that sort of is more directly where I am today, and stayed on the Marcom path. And now I'm a pretty much mostly on the communications PR side. And it's interesting. The whole journey kind of sounds like I'm reading off a resume in some ways, but the interesting thing is that almost the entire time I was in Japan, I didn't work for any Japanese companies. I worked for startups, or for not really traditional companies in the sense of like the Mitsubishis of the world. Um, and then after I left Japan, I worked for a few firms, and then I finally got my very first role with a major Japanese company. It was just 7 or 8 years ago. So it's only been the last almost, three-quarters of a decade that I've been really exposed to working within the Japanese corporate environment.
Yeah, and it sounds like your career's been a little bit windy, I guess some people would characterize it. So, how did you kind of retain a sense of career moving through all those different places? Because it can be scary for people to try to pivot or to even be open to trying new things and to just not be on a set career path. How did you maneuver through your career path in a way that felt comfortable for you?
A lot of it, I think, was just pursuing the core skills that I knew I had. So I knew I could always write, quite good with a written logical argument. I knew I could parlay that and do that better for clients, and customers and so on. So I figured as long as I had writing to kind of fall back on, there was something I could do. And as long as I thought there was something I could do, I lost fear. So, when you're not afraid of being unemployed, or of making a living, that opens up, I think, a lot of opportunity. But at the same time, I think it also lets you, or in a good and bad way, see that it's okay if I don't stay in this job for a long time. So it may have affected me in that way earlier on in my career. And I also do have, frankly, some ADHD struggles, which lately, diagnosed late in life, but it explains a lot of my career movements and, sort of some impulsive things I did earlier on. But fortunately, there's a healthy touch of anxiety to manage manage that from the other side. The thing is, though, that if as long as I was kind of focusing on, I really enjoy the creative part of this, and I enjoy creating. I'm curious about stuff. I'll keep asking questions. It just landed me in the right directions, not always in the right places, but certainly in the right directions. And earlier on in my life, I would have said, okay, I felt a bad fit, wasn't going well, and that's a sure enough time to go. Nowadays, I would think, hang in there a little longer, stick with it, see where, things change. But yeah, I just had that kind of writing to fall back on. And then, of course, I spoke Japanese. So, being a non Japanese person in Japan who had decent writing skills, could speak Japanese, was one thing. The other side of it is I'm a fairly extroverted individual, let's say, right? So early on, I caught on to the networking bug and started to just make a lot of connections, primarily in Tokyo at the time. Early .com days. Anybody who's listened to my show, or some of the folks who I've had on my show, and I think even people who've been on this show might be familiar with those early days of kind of social media in Tokyo. And I was one of the players there. Never became a major one, but I certainly was in that area. And I made so many connections. So much so that if you have some skill and you have the right, I think, attitude to meet people and be sort of, you don't have to be an extrovert to meet people, but to network. And at that time it was all in person. You can get away with a lot in Tokyo. So I just, would tell people I'm a writer, and they believed me and they hired me. So I had to be connected with them first, though, for that to happen. So, went to a lot of networking events, built a really great network of people. Nowadays, I would say it was probably a little less discriminate than I should have been. Now we need to be more prescriptive about who we connect with, especially with the proliferation of social media and other tools. But in those days, it was basically a free for all. And you know, you have LinkedIn. Oh, I have LinkedIn too. Let's connect. That was the connection. That was enough. So yeah, so combination of writing, that network, that curiosity, and speaking Japanese, I think was a good formula to ensure that I was employed, and I found my way. Once I figured out that I like to write and I like to be creative.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm the poster child of you don't have to be an extrovert to network because every single personality test I've ever taken, I've been 100% introverted, and yet here I am. So, anybody who struggles with that, I'm a big proponent of. I don't know if this is an actual thing, but project based networking, which is basically what this podcast is, just being able to connect with people to work together and build a network that way. So,
In some ways, it's so much better, and because you're directed, you're creating quality from the get go, and I enjoy having a lot of people that I'm connected to, and the way my career has been, but also the way that my friendships have evolved and my connections have evolved is that I always see connections to make between and among people, and I'm always kind of firing those synapses. That is a curse a lot. Sometimes it's good to just be able to quiet the noise and say, there's this very directed and purposeful reason why I need to connect with people, and it's very meaning based. And sometimes that's a lot more effective. I think you're doing a wonderful job with the podcast, and you're on the right track from my point of view, anyway. If you don't mind me saying.
oh, thank you. I really appreciate it. But just kind of going back to having those core skills and especially writing, just my impression with writing is it's one of those things that everybody can technically do, but so few people can do well. But because technically everybody can do it, it seems to be undervalued by a lot of people. So, how were you able to navigate that as you built your career?
Yeah, I should probably say that you're correct. And nowadays, we will probably talk about the advent of AI and what that means to people who write. It means a lot of things, I think. But back in those days, the '90s and early 2000s, in Japan specifically, there weren't a lot of people who could write English. So it came with a niche already, or a niche. I always get that wrong, but it came with a clientele already built in if you could do it well. And luckily, I could, and I met some of the right people who put me in the right direction. But you're right. Writing does have that. People take it as a sort of table stakes skill, but just like anything else, eventually it may take a little longer than with other things, but you get weeded out. I mean, you weed out the people who can't write well. My personal feeling is that they don't necessarily know that they can't write, and they don't necessarily know that they're being weeded out, but they might find that it's harder to communicate with coworkers by email, or they might find that their reports keep getting sent back to them, or there's little signs that say, okay, you can't write, you need help. But if you can write and you do that well, it saves a whole lot of time in your journey. So you can, whether it's an email or a report or an ad or a white paper or whatever, that piece of writing done well, can give you a serious boost. And it does show, the recipients are the ultimate judges.
So, would you mind touching a little bit more on what you mentioned earlier about the impact that AI has started to have on the industry and on the writing profession?
Yeah. I mean, well, that's certainly my obsession these days, and maybe many others. Having a couple decades behind me in a career, I think I'm in a safer place than some people who are just starting out or who are earlier on, where it's going to be harder, I think, to kind of cut your teeth, so to speak, right? Like, you're not getting like the small, crappy jobs for a PR agency or for a ad agency, that copy line, edit this, copy edit this, rewrite this. My favorite in Japan was always, I need a native check. Dudes, check the English on this one. I think a lot of those jobs and those assignments are pretty much gone. I mean, the tools that are available now just can do that basic stuff really fine. What needs to happen, I think, is that you still need somebody on the other side of it, at least at the time of our recording here, to humanize it, to make it right, and to check it, to check everything. The AI does lie and hallucinate. But in general, I think those early core skills are not getting a chance to develop for a lot of people. So there has to be a different way to develop those skills. There has to be a different approach. And I don't know what the answer is to that yet. But what I will say is that there is an opportunity for people who are good writers, even earlier in their careers, to kind of reverse engineer the writing in some ways, and then figure out how to work the AI to get the product they want. And if you can do that, then you're really becoming essentially what they're calling a prompt engineer right now, and which again is I think an ephemeral term. It's not going to stick around for that much longer. But if you can, if you're a good writer, you know what your vision is for what you want the output to be. Try to work the tools that you have to get to that output and to get to that vision. And that'll make you really fluent and conversant in those tools while at the same time maintaining your integrity as a writer, and building those skills. And the actual skill of writing itself, there's always a need to write on your own. There's always a need to do journaling, write fiction, write whatever you want to write if you really want to be a writer. But if it's for your business and for things like this, don't let the tide sweep you away. Get on board with some of these tools. And one of the things I think that people who understand how to write for business are at an advantage in is the core skills of writing. There's grammar and things like this, of course, but constructing an argument, being able to tell a story, construct an argument, reason, and iterate. So those things. So yeah, it's logic and creativity and curiosity combined. Writers are uniquely skilled at that. That is exactly what you need to drive an AI to get to what you want. And a lot of people now are saying, they're using AI and they're saying, yeah, I'm doing, I'm getting all this stuff covered. I'm writing emails. I'm doing basic ad copy, or I'm writing press releases with AI. Sure, of course, it's not a problem. You can just type into, I need a press release about XYZ and you'll get it. But you realize that if you can think about writing a really thorough prompt and instructions for the AI that you're using, that itself is a really interesting exercise of writing. And the output will determine how good you are in many ways. Of course, there's an argument to be made that it really doesn't matter that much as long as the words are sort of there in any order, the AI will get it. But it's not exactly true. I mean, there's a lot of nuance there. Different tools do different things. I'm certainly not fluent in any of them, but from what I've seen so far, if you can assume a role, if you can put your mind into, like, as a good writer does, put your mind into the audience and into the customer or the client, and create a prompt in that mode, and then tell a story in that mode, and have your AI learn that story, and then interact with it, teach it. This is the iteration part. Kind of continue to question it to get it to where you want to be. That our art of questioning, art of interviewing, art of laying out a good solid instruction is a writer's forte. So we still have a big role to play, and I think that role is just beginning as we go along.
And just given how fast things are evolving and changing, just weeks, days, it's probably not even worth getting into specifics of the tools now, but just how would you recommend that writers get on top of being aware of these different tools and how to use them effectively?
I'd almost say at this point, if you're not aware of them, you're in some trouble, right? It's everywhere. But what I would do is simply, if you're on LinkedIn, subscribe to some AI thought leaders on LinkedIn. Go follow generative AI. Go follow. Go look at ChatGPT and who's following ChatGPT, or OpenAI. There's literally hundreds of people who are claiming to be experts. Don't follow all of them. Find one or two that you're happy with, and find a newsletter or two, website or two that give you the resources. I'm kind of a fan of the AI Exchange. It's easy to understand. Then there's something called Marketing AI, the Marketing AI community, I think it is, which has actually been around for a while, and even before all of this, which leads me to trust it more. There are, some amazing marketing leaders out there, like Mark Schaefer, for example, who is kind of a futurist, and full disclosure, my friend, but also just and I've just helped co-written a book with him and 35 other people, but he is an expert in AI, or at least writing a lot about it. So start at those blogs where people are writing about AI, and experiment. This is the other part of it, though, is like you can read as much as you want. You get into you can get into the industry information, but it's really all about opening up your phone or your browser window and just playing around, just experimenting. Another one, like, is that's probably available to most people now is the Adobe versions, Adobe Firefly, and I know a lot of people are comfortable with, with Acrobat or with Photoshop, with the Adobe Suite, whatever you're using. That's a nice kind of easy way to wade into the whole AI scene if you can secure a beta membership in Adobe Firefly. So these are all. That's an easy way to do it and an easy way to see what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. It almost sounds like a preference for things that have been a little bit more established, ironically.
Yeah, whatever that means, right? But that said, there's tools and like ChatGPT changes every day. They announced plugins a very short time ago, as of time of this recording. First day, I thought maybe like the number of plugins that were available were just like, I don't know, 24, 30 plugins. Now there's hundreds, and it's only been a couple of weeks, you know? That's the rate of change here. And I wouldn't recommend like going down too far down those rabbit holes. But, you find a good AI resource that you can trust, like the AI Exchange or some of the other ones, and just play around with some of the tools that they suggest, and experiment, have fun. That's the most important thing. But I keep finding new things that are just astounding to me. So this morning I was turned on to something called Engage AI, which is an extension you put on Chrome or any browser really, and generates LinkedIn comments for you in LinkedIn. And it is fantastic, right? So it gives you ideas. These things are happening all the time, every day.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start for sure. So then just going back to your career in a more holistic sense, would you mind telling us a little bit about your experiences with Japanese companies or in positions that were dealing with Japanese companies?
Well, let me go back. Let me turn back on you there a second, Lydia. Like, that's a long list. I mean, I said earlier that I never worked for a Japanese company. Like I've never been employed by a Japanese company while I was in Japan, which was the irony of the whole thing. But of course, while I was in Japan, I was in those are my customers or clients, my friends. And then since leaving Japan, I have probably a different perspective on what it's like to work with Japanese companies as the insider outsider, right? Or the outsider insider. I don't know which way you want to put that, but you know, I don't know how to kind of put it in general terms, but I think it's a whole enculturation that happens over a long period of time. And people who say, "Yeah, I'm a Japan expert, so I know how to work with Japanese companies." It's not that simple, you know. Or I understand Japanese culture, so I can work with a Japanese company. Again, it's never that simple. Every company has its own culture. So I've seen the gamut, and I've worked for different ones. And yeah, there's different approaches for what you would consider very traditional companies, and what you would consider startups, and what you would consider more progressive kind of places like where I'm now. And each requires a different approach. But I guess one of the commonalities across everything that differs a lot from the experiences I've had working in Western environments is the and it may sound like a stereotype or a trope, but it's the consensus approach. It's the community feel. There's a lot of legitimacy to the community first versus the individual first mindset. It's not a value judgment at all. It's just a way of communicating and working. And you may not really understand how to navigate it, you know, as somebody who grew up in the US, wasn't part of my natural being per se. I found an affinity with it though. I really enjoyed the idea of sort of spreading the accountability or spreading the responsibility across groups of people and kind of coming to these decisions together. Earlier on in my career, I really liked that. Maybe that was, my way of not wanting to take on big responsibility or take charge of things, but it was comfortable, and I really felt a sense of we're all in it together. But in that environment, I think the key is to understand that you know you can argue for your point as much as you want, and we often do, and we get frustrated when we're not being heard. But you are being heard. You're just not being reacted to now, and it takes a while for everything to permeate, and you can get into a bit of trouble with your colleagues if you push too far, too soon, too hard. So, a lot of I think this is where it probably helps a lot more to turn on your introverted side, because you take a step back and you watch things and you listen and you kind of contribute when you can. Learn Took a while for me to learn that, by the way. That wasn't the way it was when I first started. at all. So that consensus approach, I think, still runs through a lot. That said, increasingly over time, of course, Japan is not what it was 30 years ago. Japanese corporate culture certainly isn't what it was 10 years ago. There are plenty of people who, are dynamic, standout, kind of individualistic, pioneering leaders within organizations. But they still value the consensus approach. So there's a lot of that. I think that's one of the things I think is real and true. And to keep in mind if you are working with Japanese companies and Japanese clients and customers. Yeah, and I guess another thing is a sense of time. Very different. It goes along a little bit with that consensus decision making and consensus discussion that naturally takes longer. But a friend of mine always says that Japanese don't make decisions until they make the decision. I mean, it's a silly thing to say, but they make the decision and they do it. And sometimes it's with crazy rapidity that's surprising. And it's always nice when that happens. And sometimes things take a lot longer. When they take a lot longer, I've learned that, yeah, usually there's a pretty good reason. Sometimes it would be political within the organization. Hopefully that doesn't happen to you, but usually it's like there's a legitimate kind of concern somewhere, and somebody's seeing something that you don't see. So it's good to get out of your head and be mindful of the others when you're doing things.
Yeah, definitely. Just practicing observing and not being so reactive. Because I feel like in the States, you are more effective if you are kind of more on the offensive, like putting your ideas out there, being a little bit more aggressive, expressing them. Whereas in Japan, that will very much set you back
Well,
in
yeah,
a lot of ways.
certainly earlier in your career, but I think even later in your career, if you want a staff that will not just follow you, but will support you, and follow through with your vision as you become a leader, it's very important to be that consensus builder, but still understand, that you have to make the decision. So I was just thinking about another thing that was important about that whole process is, and because you mentioned coming back to, you mentioned the States, actually that's where I wanted to go. I ran into problems coming the other way, right? So, off the jet program, I go to Tokyo, I various businesses, various things. I made a lot of missteps probably early on. Sometimes I was a hothead, sometimes I wasn't hothead enough. I don't know, impatient, etc. But then I come back to the States, and by that point, I was kind of firmly in the deferential mode, right? Like I'd learned in Japan that you succeed more often than not with respect and deference to seniors. Hierarchy is important, even if somebody says it's a flat organization, hierarchy is still important. That didn't work well for me when I came back to the States. It worked really well when I was interviewing for jobs, you know, and everybody was so, yeah, yeah, wow, you're such a respectful person. When I got into a role, and I was in a senior communications role 10 years ago or so. I remember being in these meetings with I was working for a not for profit organization, but a profitable not for profit, and the culture there was quite aggressive and action oriented, of course, but like just very hardcore work, produce, 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 which you don't think of when you get into a not for profit, but that's the way this place was. Anyway, I really enjoy. Actually, that's one of the things I enjoyed about it. But I'd be in these meetings, and there was a lot of meetings, and there'd be a lot of discussion happening, and I would interject my opinion every now and then. But the most senior person in the room would say something, and I almost never questioned them. After a couple of months of that, one particular like senior vice president in the organization called my boss aside and said, I'm not sure if I want Dan working on my business, my part of the business. I mean, you sure he's right for this? Like, why? Well, he's too quiet. He's too deferential. I don't trust him. And that was a shocker. Like, I was all about building trust and relationships. I thought it might have even been on my resume at the time, trust builder, relationship builder. And here I am, like being accused of being kind of shifty because I wasn't expressing my opinions. So, I had a chat with this particular SVP, and we settled things out, and she kind of understood where I was at, and I made the effort to change my behavior. Still haven't done it. I mean, I still haven't completely changed that behavior. I'm still quite deferential at times, but at least I'm not deferential to the point of losing trust. So finding that happy medium was a really hard thing to do. So just something happens as you're a global worker, and there's pluses and minuses to having a lot of Japanese culture sort of embedded in your soul.
Yeah, definitely. Which just highlights the fact that it's not a matter of mastering a specific culture. It's a matter of mastering being able to move kind of in and out of the culture, kind of play with it, know how to work with people within different cultures. So it's more about flexibility than like mastering a specific culture that you enter.
That's, I mean, I hope you're recording this. That was such an important thing to say. That's I'm 100% on board with that. That flexibility, being able to shift your approach, really. I think a lot of younger people, especially, but a lot of people earlier in their career and earlier in their experience think that that's betraying themselves. But if you're on the same path, if you need to get to you're all looking for the same outcome. You're not betraying yourself. You're actually developing more of an expanded approach to dealing with people. You know, and what works in Japan works in America. It doesn't work in the UK all the time, or it doesn't work in Australia, or it doesn't work in the Middle East. There's an endless stream of changes that you have to make when you deal with different people. So, in some senses, you do have to be very flexible as long as you're genuine and sincere. I think it's okay.
Yeah, and I think all of the great things about American culture aside, something that makes it a little bit harder for us to work in other cultures, I think, is just that we have such a strong sense of self and a static sense where we think that I am this person, therefore, in this situation, I do X, Y, and Z, and that's just who I am, and people have to accept it. Whereas it is true that we are that person, but we are, of course, multifaceted. We react in different situations based on how we feel that day, different circumstances that we're in. And we get this very fixed sense of self because obviously we're in a single culture. Whereas in reality, if you've been exposed to different cultures, especially if you were growing up, I think that you have a little bit more of a flexible sense of self, not in like a shady sense, but just like I know what kind of person I am in a different context.
Yeah, and we are encouraged now to double down on your sense of self because there's a stress on authenticity in the workplace, and there's a stress on your truth, and you know there are natural kind of ways that this can be a good thing, but in the long run, if everybody's pursuing an authentic self, it's inevitably going to result in conflict in a workplace, right? So I think that's where that Japanese approach has really helped me, because at some point I'm able to temper down what would be considered like that over kind of overemphasis on self, and think about other. So I had a great podcast a while back with Dr. Tom Tonkin, who talks about the difference between authenticity and sincerity. And it really got me because I feel like the Japanese are much more of a sincere culture. And it's all about your orientation, really. Are you oriented towards the self, or are you oriented towards the other? The outcome is the same, right? You're being honest, you're being truthful, you're being genuine, but you're doing it in the right context. You're doing it in a way that is serving the other first before it kind of serves yourself. And I'm not accusing all Americans of being ultimately narcissists, but there is something to the idea that, hang on a second, we have to be more other reverential than self-reverential. I know, I don't want to wax too philosophical here, but I think the Japanese are better at that naturally. And it's probably one of the reasons why I feel really comfortable working in Japanese, or at least mixed environments.
Yeah. And it is so funny how building trust in Japan revolves around maintaining peace, which involves not necessarily saying your piece at every single opportunity that arises. Whereas in the States, as you mentioned, if you're not saying your opinion enough, you're not saying it strongly enough, that's actually grounds for being distrusted.
Yeah. Well, and there's a mix. You have to find that healthy balance, because there are times, of course, where it's not appropriate to express your opinion loudly. There are times where, when you have your opinion, especially if you're you have to read context, right? None of this has any import or has any effectiveness unless you understand context. And the context of an interaction in an American company versus a Japanese company can be quite different. It's reading the room. I mean, I'm just saying read the room. So you're in a meeting with your team, and it's people you know and trust, and it's just yourselves. Yeah, express opinions, beat each other up. If that's what you're up to, if that's what everybody kind of gets, if that's what makes everybody be better at their jobs and get along better. If there's somebody on the team who doesn't appreciate conflict, well, then you need to kind of understand that and say, you know what, I don't want to put this person on the spot. We have to move those conversations to one-on-ones and to private times, right? Outright, there are times to be very, I guess, to challenge others. There are times to hold back, and you need to understand those times based on the context. The Japanese tend to just be more about like, just, okay, there's really not often a time to challenge. The context for challenging is almost always in a one-on-one situation, after hours, at a nomikai or something. There are socially acceptable times built into that environment. And that even takes us back a little to something that as I was talking about earlier. We're working for a real traditional Japanese company. Like when I was at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, that was critically important to understand that. I think there are times, and those times are not at the workplace, right? It's an interesting kind of conundrum for Americans who feel like their work hours have to stop at 5 or 6, and we're not in that world anymore.
So then, how can people kind of express their cross-cultural skills as a part of their career? Because at least in an American context, we really look at cross-cultural competency as like, I know all of these cultural artifacts and I know all the rules associated with how you do these things in Japan. But like you mentioned, every company is different. It's more of a spectrum that has a few of those core competencies kind of sprinkled in depending on what you're doing. And how do you balance expressing your capabilities in specifically the Japanese context?
Like validating your cross cultural kind of chops, or your cross cultural credibility.
Yeah. How do you emphasize your cross-cultural abilities?
Yeah, you know what? Such an interesting question, because there was a time, maybe even still now. You put it in your LinkedIn profile and in your resume, or hey, I'm a global communicator. I'm a cross cultural expert. Blah blah blah. Right. In my case, in your case, like, yeah, I mean, it's obvious. We've spent a lot of time in other environments, so the assumption is on the side of, okay, he's not, he's not lying, or at least there's a kernel of truth there. There's almost it's there are organizations that try to validate it with like training certificates and so on, and that's not unhelpful. Anything you can do, but really, I think now in this day and age, you have to build that into your personal brand in some ways. And like what you're doing, Lydia, you have the Business Success Japan podcast. This is your brand. So somebody meeting you, you know, can see that you spend a considerable amount of time, effort, you're creating a lot of content around Japan. So I'm going to just err on the side of, of not caution. I'm going to just kind of assume or stipulate that Lydia's got Japan knowledge and experience and can probably behave cross culturally there. You know, on the other hand, somebody who's spent a year on the JET program, comes back to the States and never goes back, or whatever, and is like positioning themselves as, yeah, I have a degree in Japanese, and I was in Japan for a year. I might give that person the benefit of the doubt for a bit, but I wouldn't assume anything. Not now. I would want to see what they're making and what they're producing. And I think the pressure is on us, to prove that that credibility and those creds. Um, there's enough evidence of my, of my, I suppose, uh, experience and credibility in this area, because I talk about it all the time, like on podcasts like this. But for people who don't have that, I would suggest start writing about it. There's something out there, and you might have heard of it. It is called the internet. It is a vast publishing platform. and you can choose any kind of content you want. And I would just start to make yourself known as somebody who has those cross cultural chops. You can do things like, joining in conversations on LinkedIn. The simplest thing to do: join conversations on LinkedIn around this topic, start to make comments. You'll start to build your own credibility. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the way to do it now. And apart from getting endorsements and just seeing, okay, I've worked in this company forever, there's not much else you can do.
Yeah, for sure. And for anybody like me who by nature is very worried about, oh, I'm not actually an expert, so what right do I have to go out there and actually produce content? It's more just about you being the relative expert in whatever topic you're discussing. And even if you don't know everything about a given topic, there's so much stuff on the internet that I can assure you that whatever you produce will not be the worst thing on the internet.
Well, that's one thing for sure, and I'm so glad you said that. But another part of that, though, that I think people really should keep in mind is you never have to be an expert in anything, because there's only one you, right? You can position yourself as understanding of Japan, for example. You don't have to know when the Tokugawa shogunate started and ended. You don't have to know the Meiji Restoration. You don't have to even speak Japanese very well. It doesn't matter that much. You just have to have a really good point of view that is backed by experience and ideas that make sense. And that point of view is uniquely yours. So if you can do that and continue to do that, you will establish your credibility, in whatever area you choose. It takes a long time, though, a lot of time and consistency.
So just kind of being respectful of your time and seeing how much value you've already provided just in this short conversation. I was just wondering if you had any like specific examples of any communication breakdowns you think were due to differences in culture, just because it's a little bit easier to learn from other people's experiences rather than our own sometimes.
Yeah, I'm trying to think that through more so earlier on than later on. And I could point to communication breakdowns here when I came back, which I already talked about one of them, the being deferential, point, which was not went over like lead balloon. But everybody, even though you feel or you hear about this consensus approach, or you have this kind of feeling that you're an expert in something and you've been hired for a reason, inside a Japanese organization, people are still people, you know. So you will rub people the wrong way sometimes. You will go too far with an idea sometimes, or maybe sometimes you'll huddle back and be quiet because you feel like you're not being heard, and that it's also another kind of like not sharing and not communicating is another kind of breakdown. This happens no matter where you are. But in a Japanese company, it's important to kind of, I think, see the cues around you and understand when this is happening, and when there are breakdowns happening, because you may not be aware that a breakdown is happening is the problem with a Japanese company, or the challenge, I'd say. An American company, or a lot of Western companies, your boss will just tell you that didn't go over well, or hey, somebody's complaining about you, or somebody come right up to your face and say, I'm not happy with this. This will not happen very often in a Japanese firm. It'll manifest in as many ways as there are people, right? Somebody just, you might be sensing somebody's giving you the cold shoulder for a very, very long time, right? They'll never tell you why. So you might notice that you are called on less in meetings, or you know any number of these kind of, it feels very passive aggressive actually when I think about it, but you might notice a lot that. And those would be your cues to say, okay, what did I do? What happened? And, then you have a valuable conversation. I can't underestimate the value of the after work, kind of relaxed environment, contact, change of context to allow those conversations to happen. You know, back in the days not long ago, often beer was required for that, or beer would be good for that. I think nowadays we don't want to recommend people to go and have necessarily be forced to drink beer with the person that they're having a problem with. Not going to lie, it helps in Japan, but if you can find that off campus, like out of work environment opportunity to just have a very calm conversation and just say, "Dostano, what's wrong? Is something happening? I'm very sorry what happened. Just be humble and try to find out. And, you know, you may get nothing, you may get something, but I'll tell you what you will get. You will get a little bit of respect for trying to address the issue in a manner that didn't embarrass anybody, and that kind of gives somebody safety that they need to talk. So I know you asked about specific kind of communication breakdown, I guess, examples. So, I'll give you a good one. Here's a really great one, and it's quite specific. I was This is when I was working for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and I don't think anybody would mind me talking about this. It's not I'm not revealing any industry secrets or proprietary information, but I loved working for MHI. The experience was just like not many Westerners, non-Japanese people into get that kind of inside look into one of the world's oldest, largest, most powerful organizations. And despite what's happening in the Japanese economy here and there, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries is a force to be reckoned with, and it's a very impressive and extensive company. Has a lot of problems that happen with companies, and a lot of the problems it has are a lot of it is organizational and due to just conflicts. I think with the pace of external change sometimes, but generally speaking, they'll get the answers. They are a long view company. But anyway, the breakdown. I mentioned hierarchy and deference before. So I was running marketing communications for MHI in the Americas, and part of my role was to work with senior executives when they came over from Japan for events and for meetings. Like be the point man for media, make sure that the event was going properly, make sure that that they were being well taken care of. But from a marketing communication standpoint, make sure I had the right things to say, they were briefed, et cetera, et cetera. And I was part of the leadership team. So there was nobody else in the Americas in marketing and communications who I reported to. So I was reporting to Japan, and CEO, the global CEO and chairman would come over often, or some senior executives. So every year there's a big conference in Houston called Sierra Week, and big energy conference. And Mitsubishi Heavy was a very big player and is a big player in energy. And earlier on we were starting. It was like our first time really having a big presence there, and a lot of nerves around it. Big retinue coming over from Japan, including the CEO. Now, I had met the CEO before. I had steak and shochu with him and others, but I felt okay. I knew him. Like I knew him enough. He knew who I was, and and he did. I mean, he's what a genuinely lovely man, Miyanaga-san. Anyway, so Miyanaga-san was coming over to the States. I was in charge of just making sure he was briefed. Time zones didn't work in my favor. There were some problems with briefing documents. So I had to get it to him before he got on the plane, right? Normally, I would follow channels, and there are specific channels to communicate with senior people, right? You have to CC this person, you have to go through a boss, you have to go through the secretariat, you have to go through this, right? I skipped all of that because I wanted to get the brief in front of him. I CC'd all these people, they were all aware of this, and I said, I'm very sorry for the suddenly emailing you, but here's the brief for the next week. And I hope you have time to review it and read it on the airplane. Very much looking forward to seeing you next week. Yours respectfully, Dan. So I sent out this email. I think it took 15 minutes before some of the people between me and him, me and the CEO, who were within the communications organization in Tokyo, were in full-fledged panic, hair on fire panic. Oh my God, Dan, you went straight to the CEO. You sent him an email directly. How could you possibly do this? So I bucked the trend a little there, and so I did this, and I was unapologetic about it. It needed to get done, but that the group and my boss at the time, or like not my direct boss, but guy leading the team was like, oh, Dan-chan, like very resigned and we need to have a talk. And, you know, there was friction for quite a while. I had to send out some deep apologies to some people on my team. And when the CEO came, so my boss said, the one thing you need to do, Dan, when the CEO comes, when you see him, first time you have a moment, apologize profusely for sending him an email directly, please. Or, and talk to his secretary who's gonna be with him, and just approach him and just get a few minutes, please. I mean, it's important. Fine. I saw them in Houston the following following week. As soon as the secretary walked through the door and me and Agasan walked through the door, I said, "Oh, me and Agasan," and I bowed. He said, "Oh, Dan," but he went out, grabbed a cookie, and went his way. The secretary, I grabbed the secretary and I said, "You know what? I'm so sorry for that meal." He said, "Oh, no, 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 don't you worry. He's everybody's CEO." Right? Everybody's CEO, not just your boss's CEO. He's everybody's CEO. You should be able to talk to him. Now that was an amazing resolution to this long kind of I wasted hours and hours on this communication breakdown because the people in between, you know, were very, very, very concerned because they were in that 100% Japanese mold of what that company's etiquette demanded. But me as an outside insider, I had a little bit of freedom, license to go a little bit out of the way. Nothing I did was improper or untoward. It was just bucking the system and going out around channels. But that was, you know, I was never gonna get fired for it. But it was like, oh man, now I got to genuflect and wasn't really pleased with that. But after all that happened, and I duly reported back to our Joe of our department head. I said, this is what happened, and they were like, oh, thank goodness. Oh, that's oh, we're so relieved. They don't have a relationship with the CEO that I had, and I realized that time as an outsider, it was a little bit easier. So, I don't know if that fully answered the question, but that was a big kind of the lesson there is, sometimes you have to break the chain to make sure that your ultimate customer or client is served, and service is the key. But you may not be appreciated for that effort internally, and you have to play the apology game within Japan to make things right.
Yeah, it really shows how much power a outside employee in whatever context can have as long as they are willing to play with that power respectfully, because it would be different if you were somebody who was just like, I refuse to apologize because that was the right thing to do in this context. No, you have to step back. You have to be willing to acknowledge the fact that you did make people uncomfortable. Even if it was the right thing to do, it was still a very difficult situation for a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. I vented to my boss, who was also non-Japanese in Tokyo, whose name is also Dan. I was like, Dan, get this guy under control. What's happening here? He's like, oh man, Nestle, don't worry. Just press the ignore button and do what you need to do. So, he helped me calm down a lot. He's genuinely good. You should have him on your show. Actually, I'll recommend you to talk to him. But yeah, it's just a heck of an experience. And that's one of many, many experiences in Japan. I mean, I had clashes earlier in my career with startup CEO, when I was like, 27, 28 years old, where I was, really knew I was in the right place. Knew I was on the right path. I was morally convinced that I had the right thing to say. And I was, and I did, but it still was the wrong time, you know? And I didn't make any friends for that, for those things that happened. So you learn over time.
Yeah, moral conviction doesn't get you very far if you can't get along with other people.
Yeah, yeah. You need to be flexible, like you said earlier. Just flexibility.
So, if you were chatting with somebody who was going to Japan for business and they really didn't know much about Japan or what to expect when they got there, what's one piece of information or skill that you would impart to them?
Pause and listen. I think that's the thing. Like, they tend to focus, and people who've gone to Japan often call me. I'm the only one on our leadership team now here who has extensive Japan experience. Although now we've been back and forth with the current team, and people understand more. But people will ask me, "Do I need a business card? How what's this bowing thing? How should I eat?" Those are good things. Like, those are all important things. Don't get me wrong; those are great things to do. It will win you friends and influence, and make anything that you can do to make inroads and to show respect for the culture. Don't leave your chopsticks in the food. Those things. Do the basics. But really, the best thing that you can do, people understand that you are not of their culture. They know that, right? They're not expecting you to come in and get the correct angle when you bow to this person. They're not even expecting you to exchange a business card the proper way. But they will really have tremendous respect if you come in and go contrary to the typical stereotype of the loud and aggressive Westerner and go with positive intent. Listen first. One thing I learned early, like even back in maybe when I was teaching on the JET program, is Japanese students need more time to answer a question. So, like, if you ask a question and it's silence, it doesn't mean they don't know the answer or that they don't want to answer. It can mean many things. It can mean somebody is shy to be the first person to answer, or it can mean they're just trying to process the question. But somebody told me the 7-second rule. Wait 7 seconds. 7 seconds is an eternity in a conversation like this. But when you're there for business with non-native speakers and you're kind of talking, you know, take that moment to pause, listen, and think. And then if after 7 or 10 seconds you're not getting that next part of the conversation, ask a follow-up question. And the second part of that I would say, which I'm probably terrible at, but the second part of that is try not to ask nested questions. you know, keep your when you ask questions of people, keep them simple. Break it down. Um, the language structure is different, and you may come across some misinterpretations if you start to layer in question within question within question.
Yeah. And that's why it's so important to learn Japanese. Even if you only know basic Japanese, it kind of gives you a sense of how ideas are expressed in Japanese. So it can help you learn how to speak English in a way that's more intuitive to a Japanese listener. So no effort to learn Japanese is wasted, I think.
Oh no, it's always good. And plus, look, the other big thing is that there's different tools available now. Carry your Everybody's got a translator in their pocket. Use it. Be very patient. Use the translator when you don't know, and yeah, just respect, listen, simple questions, simplify your questions. Not simple questions. Simplify your way of asking questions. And yeah, use your translator. That would be a good policy, I think, no matter where you go in the world, probably.
So, thank you so much for such a in-depth conversation. I think that we hit on a lot of really interesting points for people, and I was just curious if there was anything that you wish I had asked you or that you wish that you had gotten a little bit more time to talk about before we wrap things up today.
I was just expecting a good freewheeling conversation about Japan and a little bit about what I knew about it, the little things I knew, and I think we got that. And it's been a pleasure kind of hearing your thoughts about this too. And yeah, I think that we covered mostly everything. I would say that maybe the only area that we didn't really talk about is personal connections to Japan, and people who know that I was there for 16 years, but that I also married a Japanese. I have a Japanese wife, and my kids are both very involved. Bicultural. They're currently dual citizens, but and my older daughter is actually at ICU in Japan. So I maintain a very important connection to Japan. I'm connected to my in-laws in the countryside near Mount Fuji, and Japan has deep meaning for me, not just because it's how I make my living, and not just because I'm into the business culture, but it's such a deep part of who I am now, and it's my family, and you know that makes me sometimes caught between cultures, and sometimes it's harder to be fully engaged in American society necessarily, but it's worth it. And I really feel like it's just deep in my soul. That said, I'm not going back to live, not to live. Yeah,
Just to get your booster shot.
yeah, that's right.
So, yeah, thanks again so much for sharing your time. And I hope that you enjoy your next visit to Japan.
Oh, I will. And yeah, if anybody wants to reach me, just go to you can hear me on the Dan Nessel Show, and check me out on LinkedIn. I'm very connected to a lot of people you probably know, and I know Lydia, but I'm talking to your listeners. It's very likely if you're in Japan and you look me up, we probably we're probably 2 degrees apart if we're not connected already.
Yeah, definitely. The circles overlap very quickly
Very
in the
much, yeah.
Japan space. So, yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks, Lydia.
I hope that you enjoyed today's interview. If you'd like to learn more about Dan, marketing, or to check out his podcast, be sure to check out the links in the description of this episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and share it with a friend, colleague, or connection on LinkedIn to help spread the perspectives and information shared in the podcast. And please remember to go ahead and subscribe or follow on whatever platform you're using, and also leave a rating and review if you enjoy the podcast. If you would like to support this project, there are a few things that you can do. You can support the podcast using the listener support button on Spotify for podcasters, or contribute to my Ko-fi page, where I'm currently raising money for a new mic to hopefully improve the audio quality of future interviews. You can find the link to do so in the description. As always, feel free to email me at businesssuccessjapan@gmail.com if you have any other questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes or interview topics. I'd love to hear from you directly, so if you'd like to leave a voice message, you can find a link to do that in the description as well. But for now, remember that the more you learn, the more confident you will become as you explore all of the opportunities Japan has to offer you. Until next time, mata kondo.